Hello everyone, and welcome to the Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. There are a few things that Islamo-critics say that are either outright untrue or misleading, the latter category being the most dangerous because it unwittingly leads to the spread of propagandistic messages. Now, the reason I'm making this video is because as an Islamo-critic myself, I hate it when my people, so to speak, spread false or misleading information. I believe that we, in the Islamo-critic sector of the society, do not need false or misleading information in order to make the case that Islam is dangerous and some forms of it largely undesirable in Europe or North America. There is enough damning information out there about Islam that is indeed true, so that we really don't need to taint ourselves with bollocks intel. So, without further ado, let's go into the 6 things that Islamo-critics get really wrong. 6. Angola banned Islam. There are various memes around the Islamo-critic corner that purport to inform the reader that Angola banned Islam and it destroyed all the mosques. It also doesn't help that there are publications such as The Guardian, the Daily Mail, IB Times, and also more partisan sources like the Conservative Post, who still keep articles on their sites stating that Angola may have indeed banned Islam. The reality is that Angola did not ban Islam, not even by a long shot. They also did not destroy all the mosques. The whole frenzy started in 2013 when the Minister of Culture and Religious Affairs from Angola issued a public statement that Islam did not meet the criteria to be a recognized religion in the nation, and as such, until further orders, all state-funded mosques and Islamic centers will be shut down. Now, I can understand why Americans didn't get what this means, but I would have expected more from my fellow Europeans, since Angola has a similar system with Europe when it comes to dealing with religious affairs. The Angolan law states that in order for a religion to be recognized by the state, it needs to have at least 100,000 followers, a condition that Islam does not fulfill, as the total number of Muslims in the Portuguese-speaking African nation is around 90,000. The status of recognized religion confers some state funding and other perks. Not being a recognized religion, however, does not mean that the religion itself is banned. It just means that it does not have access to state funding and other perks offered by the government to religious organizations. To put it more simply, Islam has in Angola the status that Jehovah's Witnesses have in Eastern Europe and some countries of Western Europe, namely that it is viewed as just another NGO and deemed irrelevant by the Ministry of Culture. In any event, the information that Angola banned Islam is absolutely false, and any Islamo-critic watching this should stop spreading this false piece of information. 5. Japan banned Islam. The source of this idea is unknown. It may appear to have originated from Stormfront, although even there the users point out that it is indeed a hoax. One of the reasons this hoax is still believed by many in the Islamo-critic community is because there are indeed credible reports that Muslim immigrants are purposefully being made uncomfortable by your average Japanese, and the public consensus in Japan is that Islam is a backwards religion that should not be tolerated at all in the civilized society of Japan. However, there is no governmental ban on Islam, as freedom of religion is a fundamental value of the modern Japanese state, just like in any other civilized nation. Moreover, the state census doesn't even ask the citizens what is their religious affiliation, as the state considers this information to be of a private matter and not the business of the government. As such, the total number of Muslims in Japan is unknown, but the best guesstimates are that there are at least 100,000 Muslims in this country and at least 30 mosques, with one of the oldest ones being built in 1938. Now, when compared to the population of Japan of almost 130 million people, Muslims represent not just a tiny minority, but an absolutely irrelevant and marginal community. Nevertheless, Muslims do exist in Japan, and they were highly visible after some Islamic State attacks when they demanded the government do something about the ISIS problem, something that you don't really see from the Muslims in Britain, for instance. Some blogs take this myth further and claim that the reason Japan has no Islamic terrorism is because Japan has no Muslims, but in reality, the reason Japan has no Islamic terrorism is because it has a highly nationalistic population which tends to exclude and marginalize anything that deviates too much from the Japanese ideal and norm. Let's not forget that Japan was at one point still expelling very young children born in Japan for the simple reason that their grandfather was Korean and as such the child was not Japanese enough. So yeah, when it comes to Japan, high aversion towards immigration of any kind is still the norm. I'm not saying that it is a good thing or a bad thing, I'm just stating the facts. 4. Islam is misogynistic, or Islam hates women. This is one of those statements that is not particularly wrong, but deeply misleading. Islam doesn't specifically hate women, but the hardcore version of Islam, such as Wahhabi Islam or Deobandi Islam, hate anyone who is not Islamic enough. Perpetrating this misleading stance leads some to believe that males have a fabulous life in Islam, particularly under Sharia, but nothing could be further from the truth. A tribal court in Pakistan, those same courts that order female rape victims to pay their rapists or marry them, has ordered a 10-year-old boy who was raped by a woman in her late 30s to pay her around $5,000 as reparations. The secular civil system could not really help the boy either, as the victims of female rapists don't legally exist. In other words, it is perfectly legal both under Islam and in general in Islamic nations for women to rape. Now that is a rape culture, but not the way feminists imagine. In nations such as Iran, we are told that women don't have the right to divorce without a clear reason. Again, that is misleading. Women can divorce without a reason, but that means they won't get anything from the husband if they do so. However, it is not in the best interest of them to use that right because the Sharia code comes with a lot of monetary perks for wives, such as mehriye and nafaka, which are financial obligations of husbands towards wives. You see, in Islam, the woman's income is hers and hers only. The man's income is the family's income. Also, in Afghanistan, almost all victims of sexual abuse are boys. Adult women are the least likely to be abused. Teenage boys are the main target. Recently, NY Times, a former newspaper, finally covered the issue, but the issue was known to the Islamo-critic community for over a decade now. I know I learned about it in 2009, and it was already very old news. Does all of this mean that Islam is a misandric culture rather than a misogynistic culture? Of course not. It's both. That's why I said it's misleading to focus solely on the misogyny part. That paints an incomplete picture. Also, the perpetration of this misleading stance fuels left-wing feminist propaganda and myths about sexual politics within the Islamo-critic community, which is, again, a huge issue. Many still spout the ignorant slogan that sounds like this: why don't feminists here in the West go to the Islamic world where they're actually needed? I always cringe when I hear or read such an argument. For starters, there is such thing as Islamic feminism, and it's not exactly new, and it has quite an influence in countries like Egypt, Tunisia, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. And just like the Western feminists, they advocate for the abolition of all responsibilities of women towards men and society, whilst fighting tooth and nail to maintain all the responsibilities of men towards women and society. In other words, Islamic feminists are every bit as cancerous as the secular left-wing feminists that pollute the European and North American culture. You'll never hear an Islamic feminist arguing for the abolition of mehriye or nafaka, but they'll never stop talking about how oppressive it is to pray in separate areas of the mosques. Incidentally, many Orthodox Christian churches still put men on the right and women on the left during the masses. The Greek Catholic Church does the same too, and no one complains that it's oppression. Also, with the notable exception of Saudi Arabia, attendance at the mosque is not really mandatory. Just recently, The Economist published another article which explains how low the mosque attendance rate really is in Iran, and that's a ruthless dictatorship. So yeah, Islam is indeed sexist in many ways, but it's not uniquely misogynistic, just uniquely messed up. 3. The rape statistics in Sweden. Sadly, this one has become so commonplace that it has now left the Islamo-critic sector and has gone into the mainstream. Quite a lot of outlets proclaim that Sweden is now the rape capital of Europe, and in the world only Lesotho is worse than Sweden. Now, many are tempted to believe this as the source of the claim seems quite legitimate, but the claim is still utterly wrong. For starters, you would have to believe that real hellholes like the Democratic Republic of Congo, the tribal portions of South Africa, Zimbabwe, North Korea and its horrific gulags, Uganda and its real and genuine rape culture, all of those you're supposed to believe they are actually better than Sweden in terms of likelihood of experiencing sexual violence. Now, I'm all for bashing Sweden for its insanity in policies, but I am strongly against spreading downright false information about Sweden. You know, I told you in the past that I actually like Sweden. I would never live there, but it's a place I take pleasure in visiting and studying its history. Yes, it is true that the incidence of sexual violence has increased quite vertiginously since the place has started being filled with way too many immigrants, much more than the Swedish society could have realistically bear. And the situation is getting worse. Just a few days ago, a new record was reached, almost 2,000 immigrants in just one day, and the average is around 1,500 per day. That's over 500,000 per year. In a country of 10 million, that is huge. Anyway, the reason the claim that Sweden is the second worst nation on earth in terms of rape is completely bogus is because Sweden has a very special way of recording this particular crime. Everywhere else in Europe, if someone is being taken by force and raped 50 times in a dungeon before the victim somehow escapes and goes to the police to report it, that incident is recorded as one incident. In Sweden, the exact same situation is recorded as 50 separate incidents. Now, of course, I've taken a very extreme example here, but there are quite a few rape cases in Sweden which, had they taken place in Britain or France, they would be recorded as one case, whilst in Sweden they have been recorded as multiple cases. Heck, even Julian Assange's case is still counted as 5 or 6 different rapes that allegedly occurred in Sweden. And here comes the second problem with the Swedish numbers. The much-cited number only counts the reports. That's coming from the premise that all reports are true. Now, in reality, we know that is not the case at all. Alleged victims of rape are people, and people lie, for various reasons. False rape allegations aren't a rare feature at all, especially in an ultra-feminist society where anything can be rape. Also, there are many so-called grey cases where nobody could prove in a court of law that rape had indeed occurred, but also nobody could prove that rape did not occur. Now, in a civilized society, we take the non-guilty verdict and run with it. In a feminist society like Sweden, we take the non-guilty verdict as evidence of patriarchy and count that incident twice because oppression. Seriously, that's how many Swedish ideologues really think. For these reasons, you should be very careful with the claim that Sweden is the rape capital of Europe. Now, I'm not saying that the statement is absolutely false. It may still be true, but with a rate much closer to the rest of the European nations. But for the time being, the data on which this claim is based upon is extremely dodgy and misleading. As such, you should avoid making this claim. 2. Putin's speech on Sharia and minorities. Various versions of this meme appear from time to time in the Islamo-critic circles, and they make me cringe every single time this happens. For starters, the entire speech is false. It never happened. Putin never uttered these words. In fact, there is no moment in history when Putin uttered the word Sharia. Some versions of this meme purport to source this in an alleged speech that Putin had on February 4, 2013, while others put the speech on February 13 the same year. In the State Duma, allegedly this speech has taken place, which is the lower house of the Russian Federal Parliament. Yet the Kremlin website, which gathers all speeches by the President of the Republic, mentions no such speech in that period. In fact, in February 2013, Putin only had one speech, which was about trivial internal business and not about immigration. As a speaker of Russian language myself, I went to great lengths to find a credible report about this speech. No such report has ever been produced. When faced with this reality, some people say, well, yeah, but the quote still has a point. Perhaps, but it's still false. Moreover, spreading this false meme perpetuates another false belief, namely the belief that Putin is somehow the solution to the problem of Islam, a highly dangerous and also completely untrue belief. Vladimir Putin had no qualms in purposefully turning a blind eye on the Islamist tycoons in Chechnya who still conduct forced marriages or they train terrorists. Also, Putin had no qualms in supporting the Islamists who are friends of Mr. Bashar al-Assad. Also, since 1997, when Putin took the helm of Russia's destiny, the number of mosques in Russia increased from 200 to over 7,000, with Putin claiming in 2011 that there is more unity between Orthodox Christianity and Islam than between Orthodox and Catholic Christianity. So if you think that the KGB-trained ideologue is some sort of a solution to the issue of Islamic violence, you might want to think again. Putin is the kind of leader who would do anything to stay in power. That includes portraying himself as something he is not, just like he was taught at the espionage school of the KGB, which he graduated from with honors. And last but not least, all Islam is the same. Well, again, this is rather misleading than wrong. Whilst indeed all Muslims read the same Quran, not all Muslims interpret it the same. Also, more to the point, there are also widely different applications and interpretations and applications of these interpretations. This comes largely from the fact that many Islamo-critics don't apply to themselves two very important rules in ideological war, namely discourse discipline and knowing thy enemy. Look, we all hate the street beheadings and many of the messed up customs that may come with Islam, and we all want to keep our societies free from such mess. But it's equally important not to fall prey to emotion and know exactly what we are dealing with. Now, without making this video an hour long and mostly focused on the myriad of differences and disagreements within Islam, allow me to point out at least the big ones. For starters, there are at least 5 big schools of thought in Islam: Sunni and Shia, which are more well known, and then there is Ibadi, Ahmadiyya, and the Quranists. The Quranists are a very interesting school of thought. They reject the Hadiths entirely, the Hadiths being the basis for Sharia law. They also reject all sorts of practices such as genital mutilation of both boys and girls, and they generally recognize no other religious authority except the Quran, as the name implies. The larger schools of thought, Sunni and Shia, are also not as homogeneous as the strict Islamists would have you believe. For instance, in Albania, in theory, almost 60% of the population is Sunni Muslim. In practice, more than half of those describe themselves as non-denominational Muslims, and Islam is more like an accessory or a hobby in Albania. You know, like the music you like to listen. Seriously, religion in general, not just Islam, is treated more like the brand of cigarettes you like to smoke or the music genres you like to hear in concerts. It's not considered central of the Albanian life. Yet for those who know nothing about Albania, they'd be inclined to put Albania on the same pedestal with another Sunni majority country such as Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia is also a separate animal, as they're not exactly Sunni in the general sense, but rather a hardcore subdivision of Sunni, namely Wahhabi. To make a parallel with Christianity, think of Mormons as an offshoot of Protestantism. A similar situation with Albania exists in Bosnia, a country in which, although 45% of the populace is nominally Muslim, most of these Muslims are not exactly Muslims. For instance, at the question which branch of Islam you belong to, quite a few of them answered, "I don't know," which tells you a lot about how important Islam really is in the Bosnian life. Even the anti-Islam activist Ayaan Hirsi Ali had to admit in her book that she did not quite understand the Bosnian Muslims, since all she met were people who claimed to be Muslims but acted very European and completely different from all the Muslims she had met in her journey up to that point. Now, why is this relevant? Well, because the long-term solution is not to kill as many Muslims as you can, but to foster an age of enlightenment within Islam. Strictly from a cynical perspective, the radical breed the most, and they place very little value on human life, just as we can see in the Daesh or ISIS territory or the so-called Palestine. As such, just killing a lot of them is not a solution on the long run. And there is hope on that front. The leaders of two major Islamic nations, Tunisia and Egypt, have gotten serious to actually promoting enlightenment within Islam. This is a big deal. We won't see the effects of this now, but 100 years from now, historians will note this as the turning point for Islam, just like historians have retroactively noted the printing press as the turning point for how Europe dealt with religious affairs. Do all of these matter? Yes, they do. For we, as Islamo-critics, must also come up with better trade-offs or solutions and alternatives, or support those who come up with better trade-offs. If we don't do that, how are we better than the cultural Marxist left, which relies on criticizing the Western culture without ever providing a sound alternative or any alternative at all, since the basis of the critical theory is to just criticize ad nauseam? Now, some of you may say that it's not our problem. Well, sadly, it is also our problem. Even if we stop the influx of Muslims tomorrow, there are still millions upon millions of Muslims right here. Many of them, they are citizens in Europe. A lot of them with citizenship by birth. You can't deport those. And if we don't want a bloodbath in a civil war following sectarian disputes, we need ways to so-called Europeanize them and their culture. Look at France, a country which did not understand this, and now white Frenchmen are a minority in their own nation, and third-generation immigrants wreak havoc in the banlieues. If we want to avoid that, we first need to know our ideological enemy. Okay, I think that's enough for one video. I'm sure I'm going to make myself a lot of friends because I challenged quite a lot of assumptions that run within the Islamo-critic community, but someone has to say these things. And I would argue that it is better if they come from me than if they come from an unsympathetic source. And with that being said, I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative. Thanks for watching.